Well, hold the applause until when I'm maybe finished. Before I start this, I just heard this, and it's something I want to point out. Today is the 241st birthday of the Marine Corps. And typically, at this level of IT executives, there are likely to be a few Marines. Could you stand up if you're here? There you go. Thank you for your service. And I have been given to understand that I'm between you and dessert. So there's no dessert until I'm done. So let's get the show on the road. And I'm going to start this out with a little music so we get in the right mood. And okay, here we go. This is a medley dedicated to the Russian Revolution. This is about 99. This is 99 years old, and if that did not happen, I wouldn't be here talking to you. So I'm trying to ground myself in history. And the interesting thing about this agate prop type art, it was very strong. It had very strong impact on us. I still today, when I look at this and I'm listening to this, I still have this feeling that I just want to join the revolution again and fight them damn capitalists and storm the Bastille or whatever it was, the Winter Palais. And I got to check the picture. I can see it here too. This is Lenin, my hero. He was the leader of the revolution, and this is, by the way, Trotsky, who was murdered by Stalin. But Lenin was a figure larger than life. He was a wonderful person who sacrificed so much what we didn't know, and I didn't know, and nobody knew that was the real face of Lenin, because he was just as calculating killer as the one we all knew was a killer was Stalin. A few months after the revolution, Lenin gave an order for what is now known as the Red Terror. I can read this Russian, and it says, "Death to the bourgeoisie, long live the Red Terror." This is an actual photograph that has then been made into this collage. And to add to the foundation of where I'm coming from, now the implementer of the Red Terror, what that meant was they were pulling out people and just shot them on sight as long as they thought they were enemies of the revolution. Initially, it was about 10,000, but over the course of years, this turned into fundamentally a couple of million at least. And the implementer of all that killing was Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the head of the Cheka, which is the forerunner of the KGB. Now, here's something interesting about what happened to heads of the KGB. This guy died from a heart attack. And now this is a gallery of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 heads of the KGB between 1924 and 1954. And let's see what happened to them. This was the successor for Dzerzhinsky, who died from angina, another heart failure. So we got two guys, too much pressure. But after that, you didn't need to be sick. When you were replaced, you got shot. The next guy got shot too. Come on with the gun already. And they were all bad killers themselves. And by the way, it wasn't just that they were, and we all complain, as executives when we get fired. What happens to us, we usually get a going away present. We treat us pretty nicely. These guys, not only were they shot, their entire team was done with, and very often their families as well. So this was probably not a good idea to aspire to that kind of a job. And we're going to stop with just a little sad music because he got shot, he managed to survive, probably because he was the cutest of them. And this fellow, he lived until 70 years of age, and then wound up in front of a fast-moving train. Interesting. Anyway, enough of that. Here's my boss. When I joined the KGB, this is Yuri Andropov, who actually for a while was the president of the Soviet Union. Not very long. So now let's go on and put me in the picture. It's my. I'm convinced that the trajectory of one's life is very much dictated by the intersection of time and place where the life starts. So let me show you where I started. So this is a picture of post-war Germany. This was, I'm going to point some things out here. This was how Germany was divided by the Allies into 4 occupational zones: the British, the French, the American, and the Russian. And the Americans did a really good job because they grabbed Bavaria and Munich, where all the good beer is made. And this is where God planted me in 1949, right there. And the question now is how this chubby little girl grew up to be sent to the United States to do damage to this country. And so, by explanation, I call this a 3-legged stool, the foundation of what made me into spy material. It's number 1 is character, and number 2 is ideology, and number 3 is the pull, what makes it so interesting to do that kind of work. So let's start with the character. It's unbeknownst to them, my parents did a really good job to prepare me for undercover work, and it started out pretty early. I have to issue a caveat. This is not my mother. This is not me. But I don't have a picture of that time. What happened was I was about 5 years old, and this is just an indication as to what I didn't get as a child. 5 years old when when my mother tried to kiss me goodnight, and I said, "Oh no, Mom, I'm big enough. I don't need a kiss anymore." And so she turned away and said, "Okay." And from then on, she would just not. There was nothing going on anymore. And I cannot remember a single "I love you," a hug, kisses, none of that. What I got instead was iron German discipline. I love that picture, German shepherds. I had to be in bed until the age of 14 by 7 o'clock, and believe it or not, in the summer in Germany, the sun doesn't go down until 9:30. I had to be in bed. I was allowed to read some, but that was it. Iron discipline, toughness. There's an episode when I had an injured foot, and the wound. I'm sorry about this picture, but that's what it looked like pretty much. The wound was pretty bad. I came back from summer camp, and my parents made me walk to the doctor, hobble, who then proceeded in cauterizing the wound without any anesthesia, and then made me hobble back. And there were a few other such instances. I got toughened up, and I got to understand that I can only rely on self, right? And there was another component, independence. My mother sent me to boarding school, and I stayed. Between 14 and 18, I was away from home 6 out of 7 days. So you see the development of somebody who would do pretty well as a lone wolf, and the crowning achievement was done by this pretty girl. She was my girlfriend from 16 to 18 in high school, and we reconnected, by the way, and she knows that I'm showing her picture. And all the love that I didn't get from my parents, or when, this was my first real girlfriend. I invested in her, And by the age of 18, when we went to university, she went there and I went there. She sent me a goodbye letter and was over. I was distraught. I was completely devastated. And I pretty much, hardened myself against a reoccurrence of such feelings. So you put that together and you get a fellow who you can go someplace and say goodbye and have no problem, There were just no connections that held me back in my old country. The second leg of the stool we're talking about is ideology. And come on, move on forward. When I play this, sometimes there's one or two people in the audience who know what that is. This is my first childhood memory. Not that we watched it because we didn't have TV then. Anybody venture a guess? Very good. It's Stalin's funeral. And I was 4 years old, and why do I remember this? It's because of the music. We were listening to the radio, the Chopin's funeral march, and there was so much sadness in the room, the atmosphere. Stalin was like a demigod. And the propaganda was such that when he died, just people were crying all over the place in the Eastern Bloc. And there were quite a few people in the West who were very sad when at that time very few people knew what kind of a murderous bastard this guy was. And that's a fact. He wound up killing, by various means, about 10 million of his own people. That's indicative of, how I grew up and how ideology started early on. And then as we grew up, there were all these places where you heard the same message. This is in the background, is the East German national anthem. So in school and various organizations that I don't want to mention by name, including the trade union, everywhere the same propaganda was thrown at us, and in the media as well. And so I say this, when people tell you, everybody around you tells you that the moon is made out of cheese, you know that the moon is made out of cheese. This becomes part of what you know. You don't question it anymore. Now, what really then sealed the deal, and I really apologize, but I have to put those pictures on to make the point, was when we were in 11th grade, we were, as high school students, and it was only the 10% of the students that would then be allowed to go on to college. We all had to visit a concentration camp, and we went to Buchenwald. And what we saw there are these types of pictures, and other things such as lampshades made out of human skin that had tattoos on them, and also shrunken heads and stuff like that. It was atrocious. Now, why is there's this man up here? Why do I have it there? This is where the communists actually did a great job in cementing our ideological foundation. This is Ernst Thälmann. He was the leader of the Communist Party until 1933 when Hitler took over. And the communists were the only party in those days that actually physically fought the brown shirts. So he was arrested in 1933, spent about 11 years in a prison, and then was taken to Buchenwald and killed a few months before the end of the war. So put it all together, let me just go to what the Americans did instead, and that was what I call an unforced error. This fellow is Reinhard Gehlen. He was the head of the Nazi, the military intelligence. After the war, the CIA co-opted him and his group. And eventually he became the head of West German intelligence. That was a bad move from a propaganda angle. So what we have here is, on the one side, we had then Thälmann, who was fighting Hitler, and we had Stalin, who defeated Hitler. And on the other side, you had this fellow who working on the other side. So the propaganda was, we are the successors of the Hitler fighters, the Nazi fighters, and West Germany and the Americans were continuing in the Nazi kind of tradition. And so that was the ideological part of the three-legged stool. And here's the lure. You know, we're talking about, you know, number one, I really had ambitions to be like my hero, Lenin, and help, you know, the world, make the world a better place. We didn't have a James Bond in the East, but we had similar characters. And we had these freedom fighters that would go undercover someplace, and there was in literature as well as there were some people that we knew from the past. So there was a lot of glorification of people like that, and you know, it's very attractive for a young person to go there. Now, I also knew that eventually I would be able to drive them big cars and live in nice houses if I go to the West. But it was more important for me to know that eventually I'd be able to eat bananas and oranges every day because we didn't have them in the East. And I wanted to travel big time. You know, Germans are funny that way. They like traveling, and I really wanted to go on the other side of the wall, which was, we couldn't go there. You know, very rarely would you be allowed to go there. And what was not part of the lure was money. There was no big promise for a lot of money. Okay, so I had to make a decision. I was at the time when I had to make the decision, I was already working for the university, and my dream was to become a professor and teach chemistry. And the alternative was to become one of those postage stamps. And these are very famous KGB spies in history. Richard Sorge spied for the KGB in Japan and did really good work for them. And he was caught by the Japanese and executed. And this fellow, Rudolf Abel, or also known as Eddie Fisher, if you saw the movie Bridge of Spies, he is the spy in there. And so ultimately it became a no-brainer. I had to do it. I wanted to be special. So let's go a little bit into some training that I got. You know, I can only touch the surface. You know, if you want to know more, you got to read the book. I arguably was probably one of the best trained undercover operatives for one reason and one reason only. My base training was extended for 2 more years because it turns out that I had a talent for English, learning the English language, and that's when I was sent to Moscow. I lived 2 years in Moscow to learn English. But other than that, the training consisted of things like operational training, surveillance. So when you find out whether you're being watched, whether you have a tail, that required a 2 to 3 hours walk through the city, taking public transportation, going to all kinds of places. And the bottom line is if you saw the same face within those 3 hours more than once, you knew you had a tail. There were a lot of exercises that I did, particularly in Moscow, where sometimes I had a tail and sometimes I didn't. And the folks that were looking, you know, that were trailing me were like some of the best. They would be attached to American diplomats or visitors from foreign countries. I beat them every time. Another one would be secret meetings. Listen to this one.
Excuse me, are you waiting for Susan Green? Yes, you must be David.
That's the code words I used when I met a resident agent, some person who was a diplomat in another country. The funny thing is, the moment you get there, all the meetings that took place at 3:15, the moment you get there and there's a person standing there, you don't need the code words. You know, it's just like, because you know that's him. I never met anybody in the United States. These meetings only took place in third countries to exchange passports or hand over money and that kind of stuff. Another really important part of the training was what's called dead drop operations, which is the means of handing over material not directly but indirectly using some kind of a container, passports, money, sometimes a undeveloped film, and I'm showing this picture, which is not a spot that I used, but I could have used. See, look at me, I'm coming this way, and even if I have a tail, when I'm getting here, I'm in a dead zone, and I chuck a rock or an old oil can into this place here. Easy to describe, and fundamentally, it's a very safe operation, even if I'm tailed. Anybody been to the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C.? Okay, so there's a lot of gadgets there. It's really interesting. You know, there's hollowed compartments. Every time I think about this, what's the thing at the bottom of your shoe? I have a block there. Yeah, the heel. Hollowed heels and little cameras and all kinds of gadgets. I used none of those. The only two things that I used that were sort of not commercially available is this thing is called a one-time pad. Those groups of 5 are used to decrypt or encrypt information. Typically, you know, you translate letters into numbers and then do some math on the numbers. And in this case, it would be that I had an identical pad that, to what was in the center. So, and this was essentially, this kind of encryption method is, you can't break the code because it's pseudo-random and there's no pattern to it. That one was on a commercially available pad but I had to develop it. It was not visible. The same thing was a pad that I used that was used for secret writing. This one, the first 10 pages of this pad were impregnated with some kind of chemical that then would be used like contact paper to put secret writing on an open letter, and then would be developed at the other end. So, and for communication purposes, you know, I used a shortwave radio, and I received Morse code numbers that then I then used to translate into messages. And the other way, it was just regular letters. So the communication cycle, question and answer, was about 3 weeks. Well, that tells you something. You know, I had to make a lot of decisions on my own, and I learned to just like, you know, I've never been afraid during my corporate career to make a decision because I was so used to it. That didn't always play very well. So, and I, you know, in a crisis situation, yes, but if you get into like a steady state situation and you make decisions like that, that's no good. You know, you need to ask everybody. That's how it goes. And I just want to mention these two guys because these were the most prominent people I ever worked with. These were Morris and Lana Cohen. They were both part of the group that stole the atomic secret from the United States. They were American citizens who worked for the KGB. Both of them wound up in jail in Britain after they did another assignment and were eventually traded for somebody that the Russians had in jail. I worked with them, you know, to learn English, as well as, you know, they gave me a lot of advice and so forth. What is interesting here is the following, that these two postage stamps were issued by Russia in their honor. It was 6 years after the Soviet Union came down. It gives you an idea that the Russian, you know, the Russian post office is run by the government, that the Russians honor the Soviet spies. All right, enough of the training already. A little bit about spy in action. I have to go real short because otherwise I'm going to run over, and I don't want to. I really want everybody to have their dessert. But this may be interesting, and I'm calling this not your typical tourism. This is how I got infiltrated into the United States. look at the travel route. So we're starting with a flight from Moscow to Belgrade. And in Belgrade, I bought a train ticket for an overnight trip to Vienna. All right, so what I had on me was I traveled with a false passport under a German name, and I had, at the beginning of the trip, I had $10,000 in cash on me. That's the equivalent of about 30 grand today, distributed throughout various pockets, and that overnight trip was one anxious moment because I was sitting in a compartment with a few rather shady characters, and I was warned, particularly in Yugoslavia in those days as well as Italy, to be aware of pickpockets. So I would sit there the entire night, so like holding my hands or arms close to my body so nobody could get in there, and reading a novel that I had bought at the train station. In Vienna, I met an agent through one of those meeting ceremonies. We exchanged passports. I got another false German passport, and then I took another train trip, this time to Italy, where I met yet another local guy that was at the north wall of the Vatican, and it was dark. And it was pretty scary for me. You're still wandering around in a strange country where I didn't speak the language, where I didn't know how to get around, and I still had all that cash on me. There I got a Canadian passport. You know, you got to understand, now I always had to learn figure out who I was at the time, because with a passport there came sort of a short biography. I had to know, where I lived. I always had to remember my name and a few other things. So now I was a Canadian, I also had to switch languages. And as a Canadian, I flew to Mexico City via Spain. And after a couple of days of getting acclimatized, I bought a ticket to Toronto, which was supposed to be my hometown, with a stopover in Chicago. And I deplaned in Chicago and stayed. And that's where I made my first big mistake. And there's a few more of those, and it have to do with the fact that the KGB really didn't know what they were doing. I'm serious about it, because they did not know anything about Chicago, and neither did I. So the first hotel that I picked was in the south side of Chicago. I was a standout there, and I was still, with all that money, honestly, I didn't even know I was making a mistake until much later when I realized what the South Side is all about. The plan was, and this was a brilliant plan, what they were going to do with me. I was going to I had a genuine American birth certificate on me, which was in the name of Jack Barsky, who was a young boy who died at the age of 11. That was acquired by somebody a KGB agent out of Washington, D.C. The plan was to parlay this into a driver's license, a social security card, and eventually a passport. And here's the key. With that passport, I was going to go back to Europe, probably Switzerland, where the KGB was going to set me up with a flourishing business, and funnel a lot of money into this. And then I could come back to the United States, repatriate the money, and mingle with the people that were interesting. And unfortunately, the passport thing didn't work. I can't get too much into detail what happened there, but we made a mistake with the application. So Plan B got me into IT. I studied again. I studied computer systems at Baruch College in New York City. And I made another mistake, by the way. I became the valedictorian. Not a good idea for a spy who wants to lie low. And it was just like my ambition ran away with me. And so, and the picture there is of my colleagues at MetLife and me there when I still had a lot of hair. The interesting thing about this picture is that there's not a single person except for me, of course, a single person who was born American. They were all from another, they were born someplace else, and neither and of course I was as well. I'm going to go past this one here because it gets really, if people want to know about what the heck I actually did in terms of, the spying, it's a lot of gray and very difficult to classify and quantify because they never told you whether what you provided was used or of any use. That's part of the rules of conspiracy. So I'm just going to go past this real quick. And for the folks who have seen the 60 Minutes piece, you're familiar with what I call the unexpected ending. I was called back after 10 years because the KGB had reason to believe that my cover was blown. And so I'm reenacting this scene with a phony Russian accent. This is what it sort of sounded like. This is what I was told. I was approached on the subway platform, and the fellow just told me that, come home or else you're dead. I decided to, be a contrarian and not go home. And the reason for that was something that the KGB didn't know, that I had at the time a little girl who was a year and a half old, and her name is Chelsea. This is when she was born. And that's her with her mother, and I bonded with this child. It was just incredible, and it was a hard decision for me to make. At the time, I was really still sort of loyal to the cause. It was diluted. My ideology hadn't really passed the test as well as I thought it should, but I was still loyal to the country and the cause, and I would have gone back for sure if it hadn't been for this girl. I stayed, and again, there's a lot more to the story. I need to cut this short, and I figured I'm just going to blend into the background, and this is the house I wound up with. Interestingly enough, when I decided to stay behind, I opened up a 401k. Because before that, there was no reason to, because I wouldn't stay, right? I can't take the money with you. And so I wound up in a rural place in Pennsylvania, and through some defector from the KGB, the FBI found out about me, and they actually spent 3.5 years investigating me because they didn't know. They didn't know how, was I still active? Was I running somebody in the government? There were a couple of high-level espionage cases at the time, one in the FBI and one in the CIA, where employees of those two organizations did a lot of damage to the United States. One Robert Hansen and one Aldrich Ames. And so they didn't know. But eventually, after the 3.5 years, they decided to grab me, and this is where they did. That's the crossing from New Jersey into Pennsylvania, just south of the Delaware Water Gap, and that's where a trooper stopped me and told me that it was a routine traffic stop. I got out of the car, and from the back comes Joe Riley, who is now one of my best friends, who was was an FBI who would like to talk to you. They took me to this motel where they rented. This is 2 wings. They rented the entire wing, and they debriefed me right in the middle, so nobody could hear over here what was talked about. And then after 3 hours, they let me go with a stern warning that, if I decided to run, forget it. They had every intersection covered, and I had no reason to run. I had no place to go. Where to? The wall had come down, and I had no lawyer. The Russians wouldn't want me back because I had lied to them. They didn't know it at the time, but they would have found out. So anyway, I cooperated fully, and so it turned out that I spent a good dozen years as a trusted source for the FBI, and this fellow, I played a lot of golf with him, a lot, over 100 rounds. And he wrote the afterword for my book, and we might actually do a book together because he got a lot of stories, and I learned how to write. So, yeah, so 60 Minutes, some of you have seen it, and this is the book cover. The book will come out on March 24th. And, you know, there's a lot more stuff in it. You know, I could really only scratch the surface. There's a lot of things that are funny. There's a lot of things where you scratch your head and you think, that was the almighty KGB? Whoa. You know, and I'm comparing this sometimes. That organization was just too big to be good. There were a lot of communication issues, and I've seen the very same thing happening in large American corporations. When, you know, once you get so big, you know, you become mediocre, and it's very difficult to be excellent as a big organization. I didn't manage to work for a large organization that was also excellent. Couple of thoughts on security. As we all know, after 9/11, security all of a sudden became really big, and chief security officers came into existence, and chief information security officers. Everybody was doing something about security. So, but take a look it's obviously it's a little bit exaggerated, but you know, I can't get too much into detail. But your chief security officer is worried about the perimeter, is worried about surveillance, you know, about the physical stuff, and the IT guy is worried about firewalls and you know, access to sensitive areas and so forth. But what about this? Now, those who watch The Americans know what that picture means, but there's quite a few who probably don't. So let me point out, this lady in that TV series is an employee. She's an administrative assistant with the FBI, and he is me. He's the undercover guy who marries her and tells her a bunch of baloney that he is actually overseeing the FBI, and so she should give him information. This is not so far-fetched. This is actually these guys that devised and that are doing the series. They know their stuff. In the East Germans were really, really very good at this. What we call this kind of a method is called Romeo spies. East German intelligence sent armies of decent-looking young Germans like me to the West, and they befriended and not married, but most often became really close friends or lovers of female employees that worked for the government, and then operated under false flag. For instance, told them, you know, I'm working for this World Peace Organization, and we need to make sure that there's a balance in the world, and you know, give us some information. They were very successful that way. And proof of that is that after the wall came down, Germany prosecuted about 50 of those. None of them knew what they had done. They were all in the dark, and if they prosecuted 50, there were quite a few more. So this is part of the insider threat, getting close to somebody who's on the inside. Can we find people like that with a background check? Absolutely not. You know, a background check, as good as it is, only shows you whether there's a criminal history. Now, no good spy in their right mind with a criminal history would try to get into a company that does background checks. So that doesn't work. But a little bit of alertness might catch quite a few of those folks that want to do damage. So take a look at this. This is something that somebody might have caught if they had paid attention. So I was, according to my birth certificate, I was 36 years old when I got a equivalency, high school equivalency diploma. And 4 years later, at the age of 40, I became college valedictorian. I just visited with a friend. He's the only guy who ever figured out that something is wrong with your story. This doesn't fit. And because he was a friend, he didn't dig anymore. But the folks that hired me at MetLife maybe could have found out. How about the folks when I became valedictorian, this is a 40-year-old. Nobody asked questions. Nobody had any idea, where does this guy come from? So I could have stumbled right there with if somebody had been a little more alert in the HR department. Even worse, except at that point I wasn't dangerous anymore. By the way, I passed every background check from A to Z, and I worked for 5 different companies and had access to sensitive information at all of them. This one is more egregious, except, again, I was out of the danger zone. That happened only about 6 years ago. I worked for an energy company that owned a nuclear plant, and so take a look. This was the age that I carried based on the birth certificate that I had. Born 1944, but this is my real birth year. And when the FBI tried to clean me up in place, so to speak, and tried to make me legal, they were nice enough not to send me into the witness protection program. They saved also a couple of $1 million in the process. But they, they didn't want to disrupt my family. But the one thing I had to do, I had to change my birth year to the real year because I couldn't possibly be eligible for Social Security 5 years ahead of time. So I went to HR. And that was 2 years after I got hired. And I said, I think there's something wrong with my birth date in my file. Now, gee, how often do you read your file? So that was the first flag that should have gone up. The lady brings out the file, she opens it up, says, yeah, this is what you signed. And I says, I don't know what I did there. It's like, this is wrong. Maybe, there's a 4 and 9. And I showed her this driver's license, and she said, okay. The company owned a nuclear plant, and there was absolutely no awareness in the HR department of that you got to, be a little more careful with who you employ. I was in the nuclear plant. So, and one more thing I want to say, and that, while I was still in IT, was one of my pet peeves. And I think some of you can relate to this picture. It has always been my my position that compliance was very often actually counterproductive. Everybody that I interacted with would admit that if you're compliant, you're not necessarily secure, and vice versa. Yet the focus in most companies that I'm aware of is always on compliance. Why is that? Because you can check the box. You can actually prove that you're compliant, and if you can prove that you're compliant, nobody will get on, on your case, and you get to, work another year. And so I imagine that the Chinese or Russian hackers are sitting there in their back rooms and are wondering, how can we make companies such and such non-compliant? That would be really good, right? What I saw is that the effort to be compliant and check all the boxes actually took resources away from security efforts. And recently, last week, I was at a conference and I heard Dr. Edward Amoroso speak. He is an eminent, nationally recognized expert on cybersecurity. He was a CTO at AT&T for many years, and he has briefed the White House on these issues. And he took this one step further, and he said, compliance is actually hindering our security efforts. It's almost like a football coach is handing the opposing team the playbook, and it's always the same plays, and so the enemy knows where to attack. It's a little bit exaggerated, but he's got a point. And I wish we could, companies often say, we are proud to be a compliance-oriented company. I wish we could change this, to something like we are security-oriented and have a little more awareness of that. This is not going to go away, and the threats are only going to get bigger. So That's just what I wanted to say about that. And guess what? With that, the last second just expired. I'm really good. So I'm done. Thank you. And of course, I'm taking questions.
We're going to bring dessert out, but Jack, as he said, he's happy to answer a couple of questions.
So thank you so much. This is really informative and wonderful to get this point of view. I was like, I've seen this guy before. It was 60 Minutes. So it's great to meet you in person. But if you look at where you were under the USSR and now where we are under Putin, and of course now this is very politically relevant, do you think that the level of undercover espionage, human resources, if you will, in the United States is more or less than they were under the USSR and now under Putin?
I think there's and the CIA has fallen victim to that as well. There's a tendency to rely heavily on technology, pictures, internet, and all hacking and all that stuff. I believe there is probably less human-type intelligence efforts going on. The 2010, there were, I think, 5 couples that were captured in 2010. They were Russian, sort of undercover, not really the way I was, but they did operate under false names. They were very, very poorly trained. And I think the bigger efforts are in hacking and things like that. Having said that, and I don't have the quote in my head, but The Guardian once interviewed an ex-head of Russian intelligence service, and he was straight out and he said, human intelligence is still the most important thing. You know why? Because people make decisions. Drones do not, computers do not, people make decisions. If you get into a decision maker's mind, that's a big part of the game.
Thank you.
Where's the...
So I have a question. So Jack, I need to know you're with us. So do you love the USA?
Say that again? I can't
Do
hear
you love the USA?
Are you kidding me?
I need to know.
Are you kidding me?
Come
So
on, Jack, can you sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game?
Take you out to what?
Take me out to the ball game.
Well, let me tell you something. I went back to Germany 3 times since I got my citizenship. And honestly, 100%, if I had a choice, all things equal, I could live there, I could live here, materially the same. Hands down, I choose here. And I tell you why. Europeans do not know the meaning of the word freedom. That's a fact. In Germany, for instance, Germany has lived under heavy government influence for at least 100 years. They're so used to the situation that the state owns their children. You are not allowed to homeschool. There are no private schools. Everybody goes to a state school. And there are a few other things, and they don't even realize that they don't have that. And I'm afraid that hopefully we don't lose this, because freedom is such an important concept, as I have found out over time. So that's an honest answer.
Hi, great presentation. I loved it. It's me, here.
Yeah, where's me? Yeah. I can't see too good because I have a light in my... Oh, you know, I see you. You're exactly right in front of that.
Light, like an interrogation.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could tell you about lie detector tests. They're not anything like it.
Great presentation, and thank you for sharing your story with us. But going back a little bit into how it applies to what we all do here, and the little picture with the compliance and the goal is great. I grew up in Mexico, so we often make that mistake. We put the barrier just in the wrong place. How do you think we can be more proactive as to where we should be protecting ourselves, and without making it so much an art as more to a science?
Well, it's first of all, there's no way that you can be 100% secure, period. You know, anybody says that, that's just nonsense. You know, you can maybe get 90%, and then it becomes a trade-off. How much effort do you want to throw into this? For instance, I was 3 weeks ago, I was at a conference where the head of nuclear security at Duke Energy spoke, and he shared with us how they screen their employees on the way in and periodically. There are psych tests that they're being given, and they check references, not they check references of the third-degree references, so to speak. You know, oh, do you know somebody else who knows about this guy? And then they ask that person, and they do a lot of things that's very, very expensive, but there's a good reason. These are nuclear plants. So you need to focus on, you know, where are your biggest vulnerabilities, number one. And number two, there has to be a bit more of a culture of like, I don't like cliches, but the see something, say something actually makes a lot of sense without getting into a situation where, you know, everybody's watching everybody else. That's counterproductive. But, you know, just have a little more awareness. I mean, the example that I told about the HR people, that HR person particularly, that's probably can be repeated all over the place. We have security awareness within IT now, thank God. The other thing, for instance, some companies do that. They do, you know, they do phishing exercises, and if somebody falls for a fish, they get thrown into either get put on a wall of shame or get thrown into a program to be educated. It is important. It is important as part of our way of life. You know, we don't. Thank God we don't have to be Israel, but you know, but in Israel they're doing it, right? So.